Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ross Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. The Kentucky Wildcats, they've been about the only college basketball team that's been getting big news recently, and perhaps the biggest offseason move that they could have possibly asked for has just occurred because Antonio Reeves is expected to be back to the Kentucky Wildcats. I'm going to go over how massive of a re-addition this is for the Wildcats and whether I think Antonio Reeves could be the leader on Kentucky's team next season. Now, Kentucky, they've got a talented five-star recruiting class. I'm not going to get into it too much because I've talked already about it at length, and it deserves to be talked about because Kentucky, if it wasn't for Kentucky's #1 ranked recruiting class that's chock full of 5 stars, then there's no way that Kentucky would be projected as a top 25 team right now. Plus, you do have John Calipari, a coach that a lot of people respect because of the fact he's a Hall of Famer and he won a national championship at Kentucky. That always helps when projecting a team to be ranked for next season. Despite some obvious flaws in the roster, Kentucky does have obvious flaws because they've got a talented recruiting class coming in, but they're all freshmen. And in modern day college basketball, it is extremely tough to win with just freshmen because so many other teams have the experience to be able to find a way to beat you. But again, Kentucky needed experience back. But Antonio Reeves, he's not completely officialized to be back, but he more than likely will be playing for Kentucky next season because he has reported to Kentucky's dorms. And at this stage in the college basketball offseason, you would expect that Antonio Reeves will come back to Kentucky. And I don't see why he wouldn't because he will be the leader on this team next season because all the freshmen that you're going to have, they might be more talented than Antonio Reeves. But Antonio Reeves was Kentucky's best player on their roster this past season that will be returning because everybody else is gone. Oscar Tshiebwe, Lance Ware, Chris Livingston, Jacob Toppin, CJ Frederick, and more. All those guys are gone. Even Damian Collins left. So Kentucky is losing so much from last year's team, and it's just not really sustainable in college basketball to not have anybody on your previous year's team to come back to your roster. That would have been awful for Kentucky, but Antonio Reeves was the last holdout. He was a guy that some people thought would go to the draft. He decided to stay in college, and now that there was speculation that he was going to enter the transfer portal, and there would have been a lot of schools that wanted Antonio Reeves because of the fact there's not that many big transfer portal names left, and there are still teams with roster spots available. You would think with the transfer portal and how much has transpired in the portal that there would be no teams that are at the top of college basketball that need players, but teams like North Carolina, Indiana, there's still roster spots on those teams. But Kentucky, they got some big news with Antonio Reeves expected to return because he's back on Kentucky's campus, and it looks like he will be playing for the next season. And this is so important because he will be able to lead the rest of the players on Kentucky's roster, these freshmen that have never played in college basketball before, and he'll be able to say, you know what, I'm an experienced player. I played at Illinois State. I transferred to Kentucky, played here this past season, and I can help you adjust to the college game. And it's not just about his leadership that Antonio Reeves will provide. He's also a really solid player. Yes, he had moments where Kentucky fans were a little irked by his performances because he wasn't very consistent, but he still averaged 14 points per game, a few assists, a few boards a game, and he shot 40% from 3. Those are stats that you just can't teach for most players. A guy that shoots that well from the three-point line and a guy that was sharing the backcourt with a player in Cason Wallace who is in the NBA draft this season. That's another player I didn't mention that Kentucky's losing. He's a guy that will probably be a lottery pick. So Antonio Reeves was able to hold his own in the backcourt with Cason Wallace. So that goes to show you that Antonio Reeves is a very solid player. He made that jump from Illinois State to Kentucky. And he had a big game against Arkansas, scoring 37 points. He was very inconsistent in the NCAA tournament. Had a poor game against the Kansas State Wildcats, the game that Kentucky lost in the tournament. But that should not be a knock on how good of a player Antonio Reeves can be. And I still feel his leadership role will be the most important thing that he can provide for Kentucky next season. Because Justin Edwards, DJ Wagner, Robert Dillingham, and Aaron Bradshaw is a ridiculously talented freshman class. All 4 of those players are going to have big roles for Kentucky next year. They'll all be in the starting lineup for Kentucky as long as Aaron Bradshaw is healthy. That's another thing. Aaron Bradshaw has some issues going on right now where he might miss the season for Kentucky, and that's going to put a lot more pressure on Ugano Uyensu to step into the starting lineup. He's a returning player from Kentucky this past season. Adu Thero will probably come off the bench. bench. He's a solid guard. And then you've got Jordan Burks and Joey Hart, who I've just talked about in the past week that have committed to Kentucky. They're both 3-star players that probably will come off the bench. But I really do believe that Antonio Reeves will start at the 3 for Kentucky. He'll play alongside Robert Dillingham and also DJ Wagner, and he'll be able to help those guys transition to college basketball. And Antonio Reeves, being a great three-point shooter like he is, it will help DJ Wagner and Robert Dillingham be able to pass the ball to him and be able to rack up their assists because he's going to knock down shots. Kentucky's roster isn't perfect. There are still some holes on their roster. They have 3 roster spots still available, and if they can fill another roster spot or 2 with a late veteran guard or forward transfer addition, I think that would be massive for John Calipari and the Kentucky Wildcats. But at least John Calipari, his offseason does not look as bleak as it was a few weeks ago when there was a lot more question marks than there are now. Kentucky only has 10 players. You would like to have more, but he has filled up the bench with Joey Hart and Jordan Burks to go along with the other really talented freshmen. You also have Reed Shepherd as well. He's a really talented guard. That's an in-state guy that I think will play as the 6th man off the bench for Kentucky next year. But getting Antonio Reeves back is the biggest addition of all because he's such an experienced player with many years of veteran college basketball experience. And this will definitely help the Kentucky roster have a chance to compete in the SEC and be the top 25 team that they're projected to be right now, because without Antonio Reeves, they have a top 25 talented team, but I don't know if Kentucky would have been able to have a lot of success with just freshmen next year. With Antonio Reeves more than likely returning for Kentucky next year, it's going to help the Wildcats have a great chance to be a solid team next year and maybe finally have a season that Kentucky fans have been longing for the past few years. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below what you think about Antonio Reeves returning to the Kentucky Wildcats and whether you think this is the biggest offseason news that has happened to Kentucky so far, and whether you think that John Calipari will be able to mesh this roster together and have success next season. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.